Welcome, Mark. How are you doing today?
I'm great, John. How are you?
Very good. Thank you so much. Pleasure having you on the show.
Happy to be
How are
here.
things in your part of? Thank you. How are things in your part of the U.S. then? Where are you? Are you in Texas or where are you today?
Yeah, I'm in San Antonio, Texas. So weather today is actually cold for here. It's about 50 Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, but very humid, so it feels colder than that.
Okay.
But other than that, things are calm. How about where you are? It looks like a beautiful lake there in the Alps, right?
I was in Geneva last week, but I'm back in England now, and yeah, I don't have mountains like that or lakes around me, but I do have lovely rolling fields and London as well, of course, nearby. So yeah, glad to be back, and delighted to be talking to you as well about evidence-based management from Scrum.org. Mark,
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you could just fill us in on your background. So a lot of the people in Europe and even in other states, United States, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved in measurement and agility in the first place.
Yeah. Well, actually, I grew up in California, Southern California, and I went to university there, and I have degrees in electrical engineering. So my original professional background is in circuit design, RF design, analog digital design, and of course, things like measurement are so fundamental to those disciplines that I kind of grew up that way, professionally speaking. And I was also very process centric. So I worked for various companies that were adopting what we would now call lean manufacturing practices, although we didn't use those terms back then.
Yeah.
Six Sigma, statistical process control, again, where measurement is a pretty critical aspect. And as I started to get more and more involved with software in the 90s and early 2000s, I got involved with what we now call Agile practices, particularly Scrum, extreme programming, things like that. I've been an independent consultant helping people adopt these kinds of practices now for, gosh, since 2008, I think. And I've been with Scrum.org as a professional Scrum Trainer since 2012, I believe, about 8 years. And Scrum.org has, since about that time, Scrum.org has been trying to figure out how to help organizations use measurement effectively, particularly as they start to adopt Agile practices, whether it's Scrum or something else. And I've been involved with that since those earlier days and been pretty heavily involved with it the last couple of years.
And would you say you're working mostly in software or non-software these days?
I would say it's a combination. Most of my clients, I typically start out in the either software development, if it's a software product type company, often web-based nowadays, or an IT department for more traditional industries like finance or insurance or healthcare. And but typically my personal work is engaging with leaders and managers and seeing how these ideas could really spread to the whole organization. So even though we may start in the software space or software-like spaces, including data, for example,
Yeah.
we often begin engaging with people outside those spaces to see how these ideas and these practices, whether it's a flow-based practices from, say, the Kanban methods,
Yeah.
or iterative and incremental approaches like Scrum, and even for organizational change, which is particularly where EBM becomes really appropriate, where we're using evidence measurements in order to see what progress we're actually making toward goals and objectives that we have.
Okay. And evidence-based management has only been around, right, since January 2019, right? Or was there
Well,
some? Was it around before that actually?
it was actually around before that. I think it probably emerged as a term we began using. I'm not sure exactly what year, but probably maybe 2016, 2017, actually. And it was really emerging from the concepts of evidence-based medicine.
Right.
And if you just Google evidence-based management, you'll find lots of entries for that. But evidence-based medicine is using, actual empirical evidence to not only understand human health, but also the course of treatment or other activities, not only from the treatment of disease, but also for improvement of overall health. So that idea of taking actual measurement of end results that we'd like to have, whether that's blood pressure and heartbeat and blood chemistry, but also leading indicators like exercise and diet and other things that might be indicative of the types of medical results that we'd like to get. Applying those same concepts, but in the business context. So that's if we're managing an organization, we're trying to use those ideas of actual evidence to see whether we're making progress toward our ultimate business goals, but also whether we're likely to achieve those business goals by looking at leading indicators.
Okay, and we're going to talk about leading indicators and lagging indicators very soon, I guess, when we get into the kind of the practical matters.
Yeah.
Before evidence-based management came along, if you were with a client, what would you typically have been using? If someone said, look, we're rolling out agility here, we're using Scrum, Kanban, or whatever, and we need to figure out how we're doing. Before evidence-based management was even around, like what would you, can you remember what you would have said to people?
Yeah, in fact, usually the way the topic or the concepts would emerge, they would ask, particularly in the Scrum environment, they would say, well, I understand in Scrum, I've got this measure called velocity, let's say, even though interestingly that doesn't come from Scrum, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And I don't have the other indicators I used to have, like on schedule performance indicators or budget performance indicators or things like that. So what should I be measuring? Usually the question is in some form like that. What should I be measuring? And I learned early on in my career, if you just measure for measurement's sake, then you're likely to get results you don't want. So my response to that question has always been, or has been for decades anyway, well, what are you trying to achieve? What are your objectives? What is it you want out of this activity, right? And I hope no one's doing Scrum or Kanban for Scrum or Kanban's sake. Those are means to the end, and or ends. And very often it's difficult to express what the ends are. Very often they would express they hadn't really thought about it that much. We're just trying to operate here, and so I want to be faster, or I want to be cheaper, or something like that. And if you dive into things like I want to be faster or cheaper, say, okay, well, that operationally, I get why you might say that, but what would be the benefit, right? What does your customers get out of that? What does the organization get out of that, right? And we often have to dig deeper, sort of, and if you're familiar with 5 Whys and some of those other facilitation techniques, we'd often use those types of things in order to try to understand what the real objective was.
Just one second there, Mark. Sorry, there's just seen some comments that people are, there's a person called Mad Agilist who's been very kind to tell us that there are people waiting on YouTube.
I see that.
But actually, I went onto YouTube and it was working. That's one of the first things that so would you mind if I just check that?
Yeah, please do.
So I'm just going to, it will slow down my machine because I'll be kind of streaming both ways. It's better just to check if everything's in order.
Okay.
Just bear with me while I do this. And they're saying there's no feed. This is Srikanth. Srikanth, thank you very much for telling us this. And I'm clicking into the video. And I know that it was running. It is running. I can see it's live on. Yeah, it is live. So it is live, and it's also live on Twitter because I checked a while ago.
Okay.
So I'm just going to respond on that forum. So that was Twitch. YouTube feed is running on Coleman Agility Chefs channel. With this, but it's important to make sure that everybody can actually get in.
Sure.
And so that's YouTube channel. Okay. And it's also on Periscope, so to say, and also on Twitter. Facebook. Under John's profile.
We're blessed with so many channels, but that creates problems, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's my first time using Restream.io, but I don't think that's the issue because I can see everything is running. So I'm not sure what the problem is. So I'm just going to send it on each channel so that people can see, and also send a message on. I'll just check Facebook as well, just to be sure. Never had to do this live in a show before, but there you go. Let's just do it. And there's a lot running on my computer now with all these streams going two ways. And so I'm just going into, I've got two Facebook feeds, one already disruption, the other one is Agility Chefs. And it's a little bit slow, but I'll just get to the videos and see if everything's up and running. And yeah, it seems to be fine. We've been live for 12 minutes and 8 seconds. So, but also on Facebook. Okay, so thank you, Mad Agilist, Srikant, for giving me the comment. But I tested it just after we went live, and I just tested it again. So I'm going to carry on if that's okay. So if other people could let me know on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch that just send us a comment saying that you can actually see us, you can hear us. That will give us some reassurance if you don't mind. Thank you. So I'm going to turn off those feeds now on my end so we don't have any conflict. And Mark, I'm just going to give people another 15 seconds to give me a comment because there's a 20-second delay typically when we stream. So let's just wait. So Srikant saying you're welcome. Thank you, Srikant. And can you just tell us, is it working now for you? Because we have checked. And also anybody else who's live as well, if you just give us some comfort that you're happy and that you can view us okay. And I think we'll move on after that, Mark, after another 20 seconds, as long as everything's in order. Don't see any more comments, and I can see people are viewing, so I think we should proceed.
Okay.
I'm just waiting to see if anybody else has any more comments. No, so let's move forward. So sorry about that, Mark. It's good to just check.
Sure.
Everything's working because
better to not just talk into the void.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's see. I think we were talking.
Yeah.
I think we were talking about before EBM, what did we do? And I was mentioning that usually the conversation would come up by my clients asking, well, what should we measure? Because now we've got these new practices like Scrum, and we've abandoned our other approaches. And I don't know how to measure the Scrum process. How do I know the team's performing or delivering? And as I mentioned, my response was always, well, what are you trying to achieve? And very often, people initially, when they try to answer that question, have a very sort of, let's say, inward focus in trying to answer that question. We're trying to get to a release, or I want to know, maybe I want to know when we're going to have certain content available to release. Or also common in software organizations would be to have a periodic release, like in the old days, once a quarter, or nowadays maybe it's even once a month. And what are we going to have in the next release? So those are both pretty valid questions. And Scrum has a bit of an answer for those by using perhaps story points and velocity.
Yeah.
But those questions are very deep. If you think about it, they're really just talking about the activity inside the organization, or maybe outputs like a release from the organization, but we have releases in software in order to achieve something beyond that, right? We're trying to
Indeed, yeah.
satisfy the customer or raise revenue or solve real problems. So we got to help people get to the ultimate goal that they're trying to achieve, not the internal focus that they're used to.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well, Mark. And I was really encouraged. I really didn't know where this model came from about inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. But it was the Kellogg Foundation, wasn't it? And they had a paper on that. And just to kind of show people, I'll just share my screen so that we can see that. And so essentially, there's a paper that you can get online, the Kellogg Foundation, and they have this structure where you have measurements that are inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, or impact. And so this is something I find very, very interesting. Inputs, can you think of some examples of inputs, Mark?
Sure. Those are things we need in order to perform activities. So money, for example, is an input. Could be budget in an organization. Also people. So we have to have people with various skills. Other inputs are needs that we've identified that we think we could fulfill. Perhaps, customer requirements. Some people might think of it that way, but whatever the market needs are, those are some of the inputs that we could use.
And what do you think about customer feedback and end user feedback? Would you stick that in that bucket as well, or where would you put it?
It could be, especially if we're taking that feedback to identify various activities we need to perform in the organization in order to deliver change in our products or services to customers. But I might actually put them in outcomes also. So this is part of the interesting conversation using this model. Usually it does come from Kellogg Foundation, but usually referred to as the logic model, as you can see on your screen there. And I might say that feedback from customers is an outcome. That is, they've started to use what we've given them in some sense, or they're experiencing it in some way, and they've got things they like about it, maybe things they don't like so much about it. And those are outcomes of things that we have delivered to our customers or users. Then when we take them back in and use them, which, we don't use all of that feedback. There's lots of it generated out there, some of which is visible to us and some of it is not. So if I'm a customer of yours, John, and you deliver a product, so let's use software as an example. You have a software product out there and I'm using it and I think it's great, and I tell my friends about it. That's a really important outcome. In fact, even maybe you could argue impacting you, because now maybe you'll get new customers that you didn't have before. And that's feedback that you never directly receive. You only get it indirectly. But I'm also maybe think, yeah, it's great. And gosh, if you could do this too, it would be really awesome, John. So let me send you a request through your website, for example, and ask for a feature or a modification of a feature. And maybe we even dialogue a little bit about it. So now that feedback has become inputs that we'll have to decide what to do with.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is to let people in the audience help us out with this. So I created a thing called an idea boards, and I'm going to drop the link into the various channels now. So I'll start off with Twitch, and I'll just drop it in there, and also I'll drop it into YouTube and the 2 Facebook channels. Stick it in there as well, and also on Periscope, of course. And I'm going to show people how this actually works. Okay. I'm also going to stick this onto Periscope. And the way it works is it's a really simple tool. So Mark gave us an example. What I love about this tool is I don't know who put stuff on it, so it's kind of great. It's actually great for retrospective. You can create your own board. So but you just click on the plus sign. So if you want to add an input, so Mark, you gave us some examples there, right? So there was
budget.
Yeah.
People.
So, yeah. Sorry, I'll try to do that again. I might think I did a bad job of that. So budget. We'll just stick them in there to get our people. What did you say?
Customer needs, requirements.
Customer needs, requirements. I think you gave an example of an outcome, which was customer feedback. So if someone wants to add a measure, they can click on the little plus sign, and you could also argue that customer feedback goes into input. It's depends on the context and so on. So end user feedback as well. And I think what Mark and I are going to do is we're just going to give you just a little bit of guidance on what should be going into, what kind of stuff goes into each heading here. But just from a user point of view, if you want to add something, you click a plus. If you want to get rid of it, you can just click on it and hit the bin button to get rid of it. Or if you really like something, you can click on the thumbs up to vote for the item as well. But we're not doing any voting yet. We just want you to add items. And so what we're going to do is explain these. So inputs, what's coming into the system, what are the resources, if you like, that we can use for this. Activities it's just like doing stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of like tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The work we do inside.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess an example of an activity could be, I don't know, doing product backlog refinement, for example, is an activity.
Right. A lot of traditional project management measures would often fall in this category. What is our actual budget expenditure compared to what we planned, for example? That's a measure of activity.
Yeah.
Are we on schedule? Well, that's likely an activity measure.
Yeah, I can see people have got the hang of it because I can see some measures coming in. That's really good.
Yeah,
that's good. Fantastic. Thank you everyone for doing that. And I can type. I never learned how to type properly, which much to my everyone's annoyance watching me trying to type. So you mentioned on time kind of thing, is it?
Yeah. Schedule performance, budget performance.
Schedule, budget, kind of performance. There can be some good ones as well. Like one I like using is like the number of disciplined events. So if you were using Scrum, for example, sometimes you can get some hope from people actually doing really good, running really good events.
Right.
So they're not all bad. Yeah.
So you might have measures around your practices and how good you are at them. But again, those are all measuring activity.
Yeah. So that's there are some examples for activities. Outputs is like you've delivered something, but you don't know whether you got value yet.
Right.
That's the best way to put it, right?
That's right. And so, for example, we had a software release, or we deployed it to production, depending on the language you might want to use about that.
Yeah.
And that would be an output.
Yeah. Number of releases to production, say. Yeah, someone else did the same thing. So you could also have number of product backlog items to done.
Perhaps. It sort of depends on your definition of done, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're effective in Scrum, if you have a mature Scrum implementation, then done would be released. But
yeah, or even released. Yeah. You could also have, say, number of bugs. What do you think? Would that be?
You could do that. This is another one where I presume you mean bugs in production.
Yeah.
For example, finding a bug during development is an activity, right? And if you correct it or whatever, it's still an activity. Once it goes into production, it's out. So that the keyword there, or a key fraction of the word, is out. as it left the organization, as it left the company.
Yeah.
Now the challenge, like defects, is a really good one because it is definitely an output. And then what if, it kind of depends on who finds it, right? If you find it in some kind of post-release testing and correct it before customers do, then you probably limit it to output. But if your customers are finding these things, these problems, then I'm going to argue it's an outcome, because now you've affected the customer experience, probably not to the better.
Yeah.
And so now we're impacting the customer. That's another way to think about outcome, is that it's having an impact on users and customers, ultimately perhaps the organization.
So that could be impact to customer, which could be positive or negative, right?
That's right. That's why I often use the word affect.
Effect to customer?
Affects the customer. Again, could be positive or negative.
Oh yeah.
Let's say I mean, if you if you kind of use a string of these things, which actually we'll get to one of the viewers' questions here. We get input from customers if they really want. Let's see, I've been dealing with expense reports lately, so I guess I'll use that as an analogy. Let's say you have software that does expense reports, and you've gotten feedback from customers that they really want you to add a feature that will split an expense into multiple categories. Let's say you can't do that today, and you decide that would be, through whatever means you determine that would be valuable. Well, that request comes in as part of the input. And you'll have to look to see, does it make sense? Do we think there's good return? Let's say that you decide to do it. Then you've got to develop some kind of a development team, maybe with user experience designers figuring out how it ought to operate, what the behavior ought to be, what it ought to look like. You got programmers implementing it in various parts of the product. You've got people testing the product, and you've got people deploying it into production. All those things are activities until we finally make it available to users, where it becomes an output. Now users start using this new function where they can split expenses into multiple categories, and they either like it and it helps solve problems they have, or they don't like it, and that's a spectrum, of course, and that's going to be the outcome on the customer.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Also, something that Joshua Seiden says quite a lot is changing customer behavior, which is kind of similar to effects to customer, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And could you also argue that however long it takes you to deliver whatever it is you're delivering, your product, cycle time, lead time, whatever you want to call it, could you argue that reduction or increase in cycle time is an outcome, or where would you put that?
That's another interesting question, and I would say that cycle time as a measure in and of itself, which is usually defined, you have to precisely. Oh, by the way, we use two terms in evidence-based management, and this is the way we define them. We talk about measures, which is more of a conceptual measurement of a result. And then we talk about metrics, but metrics has a standardized definition, so it could be repeatably measured and produce some kind of numerical or qualitative result that we could consistently use for comparison, et cetera. So, for example, cycle time as a metric is often defined as, let's say, when the development team begins work on a feature or something. Up until the point where they release that feature to deploy it into production and release it to users. And by that definition, cycle time is only measuring outputs up to the point of activities up to the point of output. So it has not yet, in and of itself, that feature is not producing an outcome yet until users start using it. But but you've indicated something really interesting. If it takes you so long to produce this new features that customers have requested, that cycle time in and of itself isn't measuring outcome, but the customer's perception of how rapidly you respond to their needs will have an impact on their perceptions about you as an organization. And so the metric of cycle time in and of itself is not an outcome, but the customer's perceptions and their expectations of you and your performance against those expectations will produce outcomes.
Yeah.
That's where it gets interesting, and this comes to the idea of a leading indicator. And I believe the person's name was Daniel. A viewer's name Daniel was asking if we're denying leading indicators. No, not at all. In fact, leading indicators are crucial to helping us understand whether we're making progress to the ultimate outcome and impact we're trying to achieve. Cycle time is a great example of that. In and of itself, it's not an outcome, but it may be a leading indicator depending on what customers value, what's important to them.
Yeah, and of course, what's leading and what's lagging depends on your time horizon as well, doesn't it?
It does, and it's quite a tricky topic. There's lots of debate about leading versus lagging indicators, so maybe that's where the denying comment comes from. I think one of the challenges we have, as we'll talk about soon here, is that the management part of evidence-based management is what do we do with these measures? And we need these measures, as I mentioned earlier, in order to try to measure our progress towards some business objective. And the business objectives we're talking about that are appropriate for using this framework, this management framework, evidence-based management framework, are really difficult goals. These are really ambitious goals. Some people would say audacious, or something like that. Stretch goals, right? The regular turn the crank, make your business numbers, business as usual type. Those are goals too, but you don't need complex management frameworks in order to do business as usual. When you're trying to create a new business outcome, where you want to change customer behavior, or you want to change the results of the business for profitability, for example, or impact on society, then these are really complex goals. And for those, we need to, because they're so complex, how to achieve them is uncertain. And if you're familiar with the idea of complexity models that we use in the Agile community, like Ken model and things like that, when things are really complex, the cause and effect relationship is not understood well, maybe unknown. It doesn't mean there isn't cause and effect. It just means we don't know what it is. And so back to leading and lagging indicators, it can be really, really difficult to determine whether this leading indicator will actually result in that lagging measure improving towards some goal.
Indeed, thank you very much. A few more comments from Daniel as well. He was saying little point in measuring or doubting. I don't fully understand what you meant by that, Daniel, but come back to us to try and clarify what you meant by that. And he said thank you, and that this is a nice model to foster communications. It is indeed. We're going to talk about the limitations of this model as well. But before we do that, I shared the URL in each of the channels, and I'd like to see if people can suggest some additional measures. And it doesn't have to be for software. It could be for non-tech like marketing, legal, HR, whichever domain you're in. And if you want to add a measure, just go to this link that's in the channel that you're in, and click on the plus sign, whichever section you want to do. And if you make a mistake, you can just click away, and it's okay. So just going to give you 20 seconds, see if anybody wants to add any more that we can maybe discuss with Mark. While we're waiting, Mark, a couple of kind of obvious ones, I guess, in the impact space would be the kind of very high level measures that you can't really tie down to what work you're doing in a team. You know, let's say you're working in a Scrum team, for example, and you're delivering these features and you are having an effect on the customers, but it's very hard a lot of the time to tie that into how well the company is performing financially, right? What are your views on that? Well,
that brings up some challenges in the model of what does impact really mean, and sometimes it's easier to think what is originally intended in the logic model is that the impact are the long-term consequences of the activities, outputs, and outcomes. You could say this is a little grandiose, but how did you change the world, right? Did you end world hunger or whatever it might be?
Yeah.
In an organization that has a mission or a well-defined purpose, we could talk about our progress in achieving that mission or that purpose. But what a lot of organizations do is maybe that's a little too hard. We could talk about the results of the outcomes, that is to say, how we've affected customers and their behaviors in the way that it affects the organization, a little nearer term than the mission, like our revenue, our market share, our profit. And the mission or the purpose is quite difficult to measure. And one of the reasons we might sort of compromise and say, well, let's measure the profitability or the market share or the something of that nature that's of a little bit more immediate concern to the organization, particularly to their stakeholders, which could include shareholders in a for-profit company. You're measuring those anyway. So, and they're easy to measure. Well, easy is not the right term maybe, but they're straightforward. We know how to measure them. We've been measuring them a long time. So that's an interesting issue around this impact is if we really wanted to use the full model as intended, we would go beyond revenue and market share and profitability, let's say, because ultimately those are really outcomes in the original model, and we'd talk about the achievement of our ultimate purpose and mission.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So it's purpose, I guess.
Yeah.
Progress. We're going to get to this later on because we're going to talk about strategic goals and stuff. Right. Progress towards our purpose. Other key ones as well that I see would be customer engagement. I'd see.
Yes.
I often see in there. So you might have happier customers, but a lot of the time you can tie that to customer engagement, but often it's quite difficult.
Yeah, in fact, on that note, one of the interesting things, this gets to the measure versus metric topic we touched on already. A lot of people like to measure customer engagement through things like Net Promoter Score. And lots of debates about that. Net Promoter Score, I would argue, is still an outcome because what we're asking people, of course, you measure that through survey. Most of you probably know what it is, but just very quickly, we survey customers and we ask them, how likely are you to recommend our product or service to your friends, neighbors, colleagues, whatever. And they rate you from 0 to 10, and there's a little formula to create a score across all the customers you surveyed from minus 100%, which says that no one is likely to recommend your product or service to plus 100%. Everyone is highly likely to recommend your product. The key word there is likely. It doesn't say they actually did. So that's where it's interesting, where the intent there is you want customer engagement, but if you're measuring it through Net Promoter Score, you're probably not quite measuring impact yet. Because we want them to actually refer us to others, because we know that that's an excellent way to grow your business, also a very cost-effective way to do it. So that's why you'll often hear from organizations, or perhaps in your own organization, you would say, well, for a new customer, how did you hear from us? And, well, my brother Bob sent me. And that's those kind of referrals. We even promote those referrals, right? If you recommend us to your friends or colleagues, we'll give you a certificate of some kind, some gift or something like that. So these are all about the conversation, right? We just want to have an interesting discussion about these things, broadly covering our business.
So would referrals be an outcome, would you say? Where would you put it?
Referrals, if it resulted in a new customer and we're counting if we're counting our market share as an impact, I would probably argue that that's an impact.
Yeah. So referrals that will result in new business, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. So there's loads of other ones we could have as well, right? So there's lots of different kind of measures out there, and often what happens when you're absolutely right, Mark. At least in my opinion, when you start measuring, first thing is you need to know where you're going. So you know where you're going, then you can kind of measure. One of the things that John Seddon said in one of the first interviews in the series is that often measures become a proxy for where you're going. So even though we put on the wall, our mission, vision, whatever you want to call it, strategic goal, whatever, actually when people see what's being measured, that becomes the proxy, and it almost becomes the strategic goal in itself.
Yes.
And therein lies a problem, because people often say to me, well, you need to keep things as simple as possible. And I say, well, and no simpler.
And no simpler, yeah, that's right.
Because what happens is they pull a lever, don't they? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. They are. And this relates to something that's known as the observer effect, which is to say that when we measure something, we're likely to change behavior of the people that can see the measure. So for example, if you're measuring sales in your organization, even if you had no targets, you didn't say what was a good sales or bad sales in terms of the number, people are going to presume that you want more of it. If you measure it, people generally presume you want to get more of it. Whatever is better, right? So higher sales is going to be better. If you measure production found defects, people are not going to presume more is better. They're going to presume less is better. And you can get you can get all kinds of interesting behavior that is going to try to improve sales. And here in the United States, for example, and I think there are examples at other companies in Europe as well, but I know Wells Fargo in the United States is a big example. A few years ago, effectively, customer engagement was the measure, and the way they measured that was what they called follow-on sales. That is to say, getting a customer to buy additional products.
Yeah.
And Wells Fargo is a bank in the United States, for those who don't know. The problem is that led to some pretty bizarre behavior, because there are people started creating false accounts in customers' names and doing all kinds of illegal things. Now that points to a lot of problems at Wells Fargo, no doubt. Measurement isn't all of it, but you've got to recognize that the measures are going to have an effect from the observer. And so we're always going to want to focus on balancing these measures. So if you have a quantitative measure like sales, you probably need a qualitative measure to ensure that you don't get behavior you don't want. So if I want more sales, good. But if I do that by selling lots of low margin products and services, maybe not good. That is, my profitability as a percentage is going to go down, and I may not want that, assuming a for-profit company. So yes, I want increasing sales, and I need to make sure that a certain percentage of the sales are these really high margin products and services so that I maintain profitability.
Thank you, Mark. I had a few comments there coming in. So let me just have a look here. So Daniel is saying output is linked to production, outcomes are linked to growth. I think I go along with that.
Yeah.
And then Daniel said, where would you put pricing strategy? But I can see that maybe he's put it into activities, product mix.
In terms of creating the strategy itself, it's definitely an activity. Ultimately, it will have outcomes, right? If you price the product too high, your sales quantity is likely to decrease, all other things being equal, and vice versa. That ultimately will have an impact to the organization, right? Does your sales or revenue go up or down, profitability, et cetera? So this leads to an earlier question I think Daniel raised earlier, this idea of leading indicator. The logic model even infers, the word infer is very important because it doesn't determine absolutely, but you'll notice that there's a flow in the way we describe it. We have to have inputs in order to have activity. Right? If I don't have budget and people and time, I'm not going to have any activities. If I don't have activities, I don't produce any outputs. If I don't produce any outputs, I won't get any outcomes. Without outcomes, I don't get impacts.
Yeah.
So if we know the impact or the outcome that we're looking for as an objective, we can maybe think about looking backwards through the model. In other words, I'm trying to achieve a certain outcome in customer behavior.
Yeah.
What outputs do I need that are likely to produce that outcome, that change in behavior? And then I could start measuring the outputs as a leading indicator to see whether I'm really going to, if I'm likely to get that behavior change or not. Likewise, if I need certain outputs, I may need certain activities to occur. Like I need to release frequently, for example. That's an activity that we're doing. So if I measure my release frequency in order to make sure the right kind of outputs get out there so the customer will buy more product.
Yeah.
That's the kind of linking that we're looking for, but it's not direct and obvious. It's not like you could just pull up a cookbook and decide that for this outcome I should measure these activities and therefore automatically know that I'm going to get that outcome.
Yeah, thank you. Srikant came back and he says you can start required outcomes as inputs. I think that's where you were going as well, Mark. Earlier you were saying customer needs requirements in a sense.
That's right. That's right.
Our impact for that matter. So the required outcomes, well, it's kind of like a desired impact as opposed to the actual impact.
That's right. When we get to talk about the management part of evidence-based management, right now we're really only talking about evidence. If you think about it, because we're talking about the measures we might employ. When we get to measuring what we're, the results of what we're trying to achieve in terms of our goals and objectives, those objectives are going to be either outcomes or impacts. And so knowing what we want in the long run as outcomes or impacts is pretty crucial to what action we're going to take and what we should measure. So that's kind of the basis of this conversation. But if we have a direct goal like better profitability, obviously we have to measure profit. I mean, that's the only way we're going to know if our profit went up or down. But if we wait, if we say we want to improve profitability by the end of, I don't know, Q1 2021, because for 2020 we've all given up. No, I'm kidding. If we wait till March 31st of 2021 to measure our profit, it's too late. It just is whatever it was at that point. So instead, we've got to look at things that are likely to improve profitability. Product offerings, pricing, all those other things. What's really important for us? What do we really believe is going to drive that improvement in profitability? And we need to measure that too. So it's not one or the other. We need to measure the lagging indicator. We'll also need to carefully monitor the leading indicators along the way.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. So just as a follow-on to this, so often I'd be working with a group of colleagues, and we'd be saying, okay, which ones are we going to pick? And so often what would happen is literally we might actually do some voting on which measures, and I talk about it, I mention this phrase, I say, what's the devil in the measure? So every measure, once it's observed, you try to figure out a way to play that game. And people can be very creative in doing that. So it's often good to have kind of tension between the measures so that you can kind of get telemetry from a number of angles. So I would end up kind of coming up with a set of measures, and often what would be picked would be something like number of product backlog items delivered to done, for example, might be reduction in cycle time, might be customer feedback and end user feedback, whether that's positive or negative. We tended not to focus so much on impact, but there were one or two companies that I worked in where the finance people were really very organized, and they were actually able to give us the impact on cash, in the quarter. So we were actually sometimes able to find that out very easily. Right. There were limits to that, and the first thing that I noticed was the first time I did this. What we noticed was that some teams, a lot of the teams, weren't delivering anything, and so the number of PBIs was flatlining. The reduction of cycle time, we didn't have a cycle time. They had a plumbing problem, so to speak.
Yeah.
It was interesting that I would have said in the past, measure activities, you get activities. But in some cases, you need some hope that they will deliver stuff. And I ended up discovering, Mark, that measuring the number of disciplined events, particularly for Scrum teams, maybe also useful for Kanban teams that use some kind of sprint cycle as well, maybe. I noticed a very high correlation between, particularly with teams that are not so mature, within the first couple of years doing it in Agile or whatever. There was a very high correlation between teams who had really very good discipline with running their events, and they're delivering outputs, and they're closer to the customer, and all this kind of cool stuff. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's so you discovered that at least in that particular organization, in that particular context, that the rigor or maturity of the Scrum events was a leading indicator to outputs. That is to say, product backlog items getting done or features delivered.
Yeah.
And that furthermore, not only that, but apparently I'm hearing you say that the maturity of their Scrum events and the discipline around that is also a leading indicator to customer engagement in some sense.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting and an awesome thing to discover. It's worth noting that in other organizations that may not be true to the same degree.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that I learned as well was, well, at least in the context that I work in, that it's better to not compare teams or actually not compare people. Don't compare leaders, don't compare managers, don't compare teams. And so what I did was, it wasn't like, your team delivered 20 items this sprint and Daniel's did 30 and Srikant's did 45. And I wasn't kind of clapping Srikant to the back saying, well done for delivering 45 items, because they could have just split them, right?
That's right.
All I cared about was when I went back to Srikant maybe 2 months later, did it get better or worse, that number? And whatever the answer is, did he need any help? So what I tend to do now is I tend to put all those numbers into a kind of a big blender. It's less actionable because you can't say this team needs this and that team needs that. But I found that for the benefit of psychological safety and for getting real honesty in terms of what was going on, I found that a useful thing to do. What's your experience been, Mark, with that? I mean, have you had any concerns about comparing people in the past?
Yeah, that's always a big challenge. I think that to the degree people feel they're being judged by outsiders, that certainly reduces a sense of psychological safety, and so they're a lot less likely to be honest. So, for example, if we wanted to measure, let's say, the discipline of Scrum events, I would tend to shy away from some external third party judging their Scrum events. I would ask them, give them some kind of rubric in which to judge themselves. And well, what if they cheat, you might say? Well, as you pointed out, I'm looking for improvement. So you can rate yourself outstanding, and that may be fine, but we're going to look at other measures as well. And I typically like it to be a dashboard, and I typically want the team to create the dashboard because I need them to own it. And that needs to be useful for them for the purposes of improvement. And what are we improving? The other thing to be careful about with these dashboards and these measures is not to have too many measures, right? I see dashboards with 200 measures on them, and what does it tell you? It doesn't tell me anything. We're just inundated by the data, and there's no way to decipher what matters. So it's really important to have this conversation about leading and lagging indicators. Find the 1 or 2 lagging indicators that tells us whether we're going to achieve these really ambitious goals, and for each of those, maybe we've got 3, 4, perhaps 5 leading indicators that tells us whether we're likely to achieve that goal or not. That's about as much as any group can handle, any team. Now, in a large organization, of course, there's some amount of hierarchy. So it may be that the CEO of a company only has 2 really ambitious goals for the next quarter or the next year, with their related 3 to 5 leading indicators for each one of those. But then, of course, they've got different groups within that report to them, different departments or divisions or whatever they're called. Each one of them probably has 1 or 2 really ambitious goals to help achieve the organization's goals and so on. Such that you get down to an individual team, they ought to be able to know exactly how they're contributing to these really ambitious goals for the organization, because they've got their own ambitious goals linked in. I'd caution people to not develop those goals in a top-down fashion, because it will take too long, and that would be sort of relegated to a much more traditional command and control approach. Having said that, we do need to know, organizationally, where are we headed? So at some level, we need to establish some major goals, and then we need everybody to talk about how we're going to contribute, and it can be done in parallel. We don't have to do things sequentially.
Yeah, a couple of comments here. One from Srikant. So just agreeing with you. Yes, just blindly applying inputs would be just throwing money and time away. Thank you, Srikant, for that. And Daniel, Dr. Goldratt, tell me, it's a quote from him, tell me how you measure me and I'll show you how you'll behave. Yeah, that's
Right.
kind of where we're going.
Exactly.
So this is all very interesting, but we're here to talk about evidence-based management. And the reason that I wanted people to see the Kellogg logic model and the devil in the measure and keeping it as simple as possible and leading and lagging and all is because there's still a trick missing. And this is where evidence-based management really helped me, because evidence-based management gives you a new lens where you can have a look at what you're measuring, what your metrics are. And so I think what we could do at this point, Mark, is if you want to talk a little bit about maybe introduce us to evidence-based management. I'll stop sharing my screen here. You can share your screen if you like.
Okay.
And then maybe we'll come back to this and we say, okay, what trick did we miss that evidence-based management would have kind of brought to the fore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a couple more things that we want to talk about, but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how we would use the evidence, the measures that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I will share my one of my screens here. There we go. So here's a little drawing that we can use to talk about how do we use these measures, what do we use them for. And you remember just a few minutes ago, I mentioned that very often this topic comes up because they would ask me, well, what should I measure? And my response is always, what are you trying to achieve? And you can see this word goal, and again, we mean really ambitious goals, difficult to achieve goals, is really central to this particular diagram. And it's just symbolically displayed as a star there, something we're trying to move ourselves toward. And then you can see we're measuring that on the vertical axis with some kind of a metric. It could be more than one. This is a fairly simple diagram. We're just trying to explain the concept. And of course, it's going to take time to get to that new place, that new behavior of the customer, or that new condition that we want to achieve for the organization, that goal. You'll notice that we're starting from our current condition, and we got to that current condition by some path from some starting condition that we may or may not even have measured. That doesn't mean we didn't have it, we just didn't measure it. And so those sort of circles in the lower left part of the graph are the path that we've taken to get where we are in our current condition. And then you can see we're trying to get from our current condition to that goal. And the implication of those filled in circles in the lower left is that the path is not a straight line. We're not going to get from where we are to that goal in one giant step. It's not a smooth path. In the case of these really ambitious goals. If you have business as usual goals, you may be really clear how to achieve them, and that's great. But in that case, you don't need EBM either, because you already know how to achieve them. So just go do what you know how to do. Here we're trying to have a different result. By the nature of an ambitious goal, it's new. And the gap between our current state and where we're trying to get to may be so great that we would also choose to have an intermediate goal. A classic, let me give you a really quick classic example that I think probably everybody in the world will recognize, I hope. In the 1960s, in 1961, the then President of the United States, John Kennedy, gave a speech to Congress announcing his intention that we should strive to place a person on the moon and return them safely home by the end of the decade. So that would have been an ambitious goal by any definition, right? There's very unclear how to make that happen. It's theoretically achievable, that is, didn't violate known laws of physics, for example. And how to get there was very unknown, and the gap was so great. It was measurable. In fact, it was almost binary, right? Did we get a person on the moon and bring them safely home again alive? Yes or no. We either did or we didn't. By December 31st of 1969. But we needed the gap from where we were at the time of that speech, which is most rockets were exploding on the launch pad. I mean, the thought of putting a human being in one of those would have been, horrifying. To, getting to the moon and back safely with a human life, that gap was so large, we needed intermediate goals. We needed reliable launch vehicles. We then needed to make sure we could actually launch biological entities safely and get them back alive, right? We used a chimpanzee in our case, in the case of the United States. We needed to be able to launch a human being. Just launch and recover. Forget orbiting. That's too hard. Let's just get them off the launch pad and then safely back to Earth. Then we could go into orbit, et cetera, et cetera. By these stepping toward these ultimate goals, we can constantly check ourselves that we're making progress, number one. But number two, you'll notice that that star, we try to depict that it's moving around, because as we learn more about that goal and trying to make progress toward it, we'll probably adjust the goal. And if you're familiar with the history of the Apollo program, of the Apollo 1 launch vehicle, there was a fire which killed 3 astronauts. And that was a huge setback. And the whole Apollo program had to be redesigned almost from the ground up. So it caused a large adaptation, a large change in the path we thought we were going to take in order to get to the moon. So that's the idea of the intermediate goal. We may have to find some stepping stone that's along the way that will help show progress, number two, but also give us confidence that we have the right goal, even though we may adjust the goal as we go. That's the nature of complexity. And the way we take those steps, and then I'll stop talking, so we can look at questions that might come in, is this idea of, we call this the experiment loop. In complex discussion of complexity in the Agile community, and of course we discuss this in user experience, we talk about this in Scrum, is we have a hypothesis of what we believe will make progress toward that goal. Whether it's a sprint goal or some audacious goal in evidence-based management, we need to test that hypothesis by performing an experiment. This is exactly what the scientific method does. And when we perform that experiment, we need to measure the results. This would include the goal measure itself, which, remember, we said is a lagging indicator, and whatever we think will be a leading indicator of that progress. So we're going to take multiple measures of our experiment to see if it actually made a difference. And then we're going to have to evaluate that measure, the inspect and adapt part, as we say in the Scrum world. Let's look at that measure and determine whether it actually got the result we thought it would as part of our hypothesis. And if it did, awesome, we can keep moving forward in that direction. But if it didn't, we need to make an adjustment. We either have to change our hypothesis, we have to change the way we apply that hypothesis to experimentation, or maybe we even need to abandon that hypothesis altogether because it's getting the wrong result. So by over and over again taking small steps, measuring those results, both in terms of the ultimate goal, but also in terms of the leading indicators, we can continue to focus on making progress toward those big, ambitious goals.
It looks remarkably like Toyota Kata. Is that kind of where it came from, or?
Indeed, you'll see a lot of, there's nothing new under the sun, of course. So this is a combination of a lot of things. Mike Rother's work around the improvement kata is buried in here. Really, we call it the experiment loop, and we've got different words, but it's no different really than PDCA, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, or other models of continuous improvement. So indeed, we're building on top of the shoulders of giants, to paraphrase someone famous. We're standing on the shoulders of giants who have figured out many of these ideas, but applying it specifically to the organizational need to achieve these really audacious goals.
There's a question from Srikant, and he's saying, is there one book that he can read on evidence-based management? Because I think what he's saying is that the guides are a bit short. Any comments on that?
There isn't really a book yet. I guess I should say I believe that a book is in progress, and but I don't have any sense of any kind of forecasted release date of that. I would suggest going to some source material that underlies these ideas. And we've mentioned one, the Toyota Kata from Mike Rother is the book, which talks about how Toyota goes about constantly improving. Although the kata itself is not something that Toyota they wouldn't use that word. They don't think that way, or they think that way, but they don't use this language. The other is 4 disciplines of execution, and another model would be objectives and key results. Those are all awesome resources to give you the underpinnings of these ideas of evidence-based management.
I'm learning things. Srikant left a comment there that I didn't realize that the shoulder of giants was a derogatory
I didn't either,
comment.
So now I'll never use that again.
Because I also had John Seddon on, and it was an interview with an iconoclast, and apparently that was an offensive word, so I've relabeled the video since then. I didn't know. I'm learning things, so Srikant, thank you for telling us that. I didn't actually know that.
Didn't know that.
But then Daniel is saying it's a Wall Street article, so I was like, okay.
Maybe so that you know what it really means and not what I thought it meant.
Okay. Okay, so what I really liked seeing there, because that's what you just showed me there, is really what evidence-based management added in September 2020, right?
That's right. And
go ahead.
I was going to say, in the early, before we called it evidence-based management, and that term in this community has been around, again, for 4 or 5 years, something like that. But before that, we still had these ideas. Prior to that, we had things like the agility path, and it was called many different things, continuous improvement framework. So that the improvement part of it, this framework for continuous improvement or progress toward goals, has conceptually always been there. Back around, I don't know exactly when, but maybe 2013, 2014, metrics sort of started to dominate the conversation. And we started talking about metrics to the exclusion of using them effectively. And so we've kind of took a step back last year or a little before that and said, okay, wait a minute. We've got a good handle on measures, which I think we're probably going to come back to now briefly. What are we supposed to do with these again? Let's get that back into this conversation about evidence-based management. Bring management back into evidence-based management.
Yeah, I've got just testing the link on the YouTube, because while the video is showing on YouTube, the link seems to have changed to what I promoted. So I'm just making people aware of that on the YouTube channel. It's a pity because YouTube is actually the most popular channel. So just drop, but thankfully the recording is available for everyone to watch as well. So I'll make sure that everybody gets to see that afterwards, Mark.
Great.
Just getting back to, so like what I loved seeing and what I noticed in the 2020 version, I noticed Toyota Kata remnants. Also, the focus on experimentation I thought was fantastic. How many experiments are we doing? And you talked about hypothesis, experiments, features, requirements, and so on. Also love seeing the references to the DevOps report, the DORA report. That was really nice, kind of backing that up. We'll talk about OKRs later on. But even back in the 2019 version of the guide, evidence-based management had some key value areas. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And the key value area concept has been around since the early days, even before really it was evidence-based management. And the idea here is, again, looking at just like we categorize measures using the Kellogg logic model earlier in this session, with inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, the idea of KVAs categorizes different ways of measuring or metrics from a business perspective, particularly from the perspective of value delivery, which, as we all know, is a key focus of the Agile community and the objectives of Agile practices. And it starts with current value. So it's important to understand what are we currently able to deliver as an organization from a value perspective. And different measures that might exist there include some of the impact measures we've talked about, like sales or profit. You might choose to create a metric that scales those measures, like revenue per employee or something like that. And there are various standardized metrics, ratios, that could be used as a metric. But whichever metrics you choose, the concepts are, what is the value we're delivering to our users, our customers, our stakeholders, our employees, and our communities, and how are we going to measure that current value? And that's really important. That's like the current condition, and whatever particular aspect of current value we might choose to try to improve. by measuring that, that is a measure of our current value. So correlating it back to that diagram we just looked at, that's what we're talking about there. Now the other side of that coin, that current value coin, is what value exists that we could take advantage of, or that is to say, benefit from, which we call unrealized value. So what is our opportunity out there in the marketplace? Again, the broadest concept of marketplace you could think of, not just customers or market share or profit, but for our stakeholders, for our employees, because we need really engaged employees to achieve these incredible results we're talking about and capture some of that unrealized value in the marketplace. So there's two sides there in the market-facing measures, or the key value areas. By the way, key value areas was a term we derived specifically to compete with KPIs, key performance indicators, which tend to be internally focused, primarily on activities. Not always, but often. And it's fine to measure activities, but if we're not measuring the outcomes and the impacts, we're missing the boat. So we wanted to really emphasize the idea that value is only determined by the recipient of that benefit, whatever the benefit we're shooting for is. Again, customers, maybe stakeholders, employees, and the community itself. Now, that's on the market-facing key value areas, the current value and the unrealized value, but we need a means to get there. And there are two key value areas that focus on our organization's ability to deliver that value. And one area is time to market. So that's a natural place that most people would go. And a classic measure in key value area we already talked about earlier in this question, cycle time. How quickly can we get from work we decide to do to deliver the value of that work? And that's the classic measure of cycle time. And so anything that's measuring the timeliness of our ability to deliver value would be in that category. But in addition to being timely, we have to have an ability to be innovative. That is, to deliver something new that's valuable, and we call that the ability to innovate. That's the fourth key value area. And that would be, for example, we're spending money to perform activities. What percentage, thank you for that, what percentage of the money that we're spending is actually going to those innovative, new, valuable things that we're delivering to our customers? How long it takes is in time to market, but the effectiveness with which we're delivering valuable things, in my example here with regard to expenditure or money, would be a measure of our ability to innovate. Other things, other indicators we might want to measure as appropriate would be how much time are we spending supporting old versions of our product versus getting new versions of our product out the door. The more and more effort, our capacity that we're spending on old versions is not supporting that innovation into the marketplace. So we might want to think about what it would take for us to shift that ratio a little bit. How do we get a little bit more of our capacity into new innovation? Maybe reduce the number of old versions we support, perhaps. And so this categorization model that's focused on value delivery itself is an instrumental part of evidence-based management as well.
So if we go back to the measures we had earlier, right, the idea boards.
On the idea board. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what tricks were we missing here when we were looking at, I'm going to scroll up a little bit so that we can kind of see more measures, but I often find this useful that evidence-based management for me is like a guide in terms of, actually, at least the 2019 version is a guide for like what trick did I miss? Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm oversimplifying there. And I love the additions, by the way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to think about it. However you discuss your measures first and then ultimately metrics, whether you use the logic model that we're looking at right now or not, how do those measures fit into the KVAs? And exactly. Are we missing anything? And I would say that it's pretty common. It's really common to measure time to market. It's pretty common to measure current value, which on the KVA diagram you just showed would be on the right-hand side. But what's often missing is measuring our ability to create new value, the ability to innovate, And also, what are our opportunities in terms of unrealized value? So very often we may be missing measures on the left-hand side of the KVI diagram. And maybe we should add some. Maybe we should be thinking about that.
Yeah, that's what I usually find as well, that it's the unrealized value in particular. And sorry to use metaphors, I hope I don't cause any offense, but milking the cow is a metaphor I use, that we have these products and we're milking the cow, and so we're getting loads of profit out of it. So revenue per employee is a classic example, right? Probably Nokia, BlackBerry were kind of following that line, and they weren't, in Guy Kawasaki's terms, trying to find the next curve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finding new opportunities.
Yes, and in fact, in using the language of KVAs, we would say that product has a high CV, high current value, but a relatively low unrealized value, and that's the classic cash cow. So should we be investing in that cash cow, or how much should we be investing? Those are really critical questions. Whereas if you have a brand new product you've introduced to the marketplace, its current value may be somewhat low. You don't have many customers yet. It's not generating a lot of revenue. In fact, you may be operating at a loss in that product area, and yet the unrealized value may be very high. And we may want to focus a lot of our investment, particularly our innovation investment, where there's a lot of unrealized value.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with John Seddon a few months ago. And it was an interesting perspective that he had. And John always he breaks my brain a lot, and and people like you do as well. And thank you for that. Really like that. And so one of the things he said to me is, like, everybody's chasing the next curve, whoever, Amazon, whoever's going to eat our breakfast, and all this kind of threatening kind of talk. But often a lot of the opportunities inside the building.
Mm-hmm.
Through ineffective delivery of services or products. So I guess, and I guess there could be unrealized value inside the building as well as outside the building, is kind of where I'm going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, I mentioned earlier in our conversation that usually when I ask the question, "What are you trying to achieve?" They ask me, "What should I measure?" And I say, "Well, what are you trying to achieve?" And they say, "Well, I want to be faster, or I want to be cheaper," or something like that. And I think they're missing the mark. Not that that's not useful or valuable to be faster or cheaper. But you're not focused on the outcomes or the impacts that we could be getting. In other words, there's unrealized value out there, whether it's outside the company in the marketplace, which usually comes from the dislocations, right? The innovation. It's not the marginal improvements of existing products. And you may or may not be able to take advantage of that unrealized value based on your ability to deliver new things, and maybe stop investing in old proven things where the unrealized value is low. It can be really difficult. And examples you talked about with Nokia, for example, or other organizations, BlackBerry, for example, that were not able to take advantage of changes in the marketplace because they were so focused on what they had always been good at in the past.
I got a couple. There's loads of comments, but there's a couple that are very relevant to what we're talking about right now. And Srikant is saying you need both. I think I'm trying to understand here. Do you mean inside the building and in terms of potential from suboptimal services that we're already providing, as well as new products and services? Is that what you mean, Srikant? I'm not sure what you mean there. Unrealized potential versus directed towards new innovations, not either or. I agree with that. Yeah. The point I was making is that people can kind of overemphasize finding the next curve in terms of new products, new services, when often there's a lot of opportunity inside the building as well, and something that often gets overlooked.
Right. But culturally, it can be difficult to take advantage of that unrealized value that's there.
Absolutely. And unrealized value equals unrealized innovation, in a sense, I guess.
Possibly. And of course, the innovation doesn't have to come from us. That's the trick of this conversation, is that the unrealized innovation may come from somewhere, and it may not be us. And Apple introduces the iPhone, and Nokia mobile phones is in a spiral.
Another comment from Srikant: unrealized equals throwing away and time away. The way I kind of put unrealized value is leaving money on the table.
Right. It's not so much throwing it away per se. It's not grabbing it
Exactly.
for yourself, I guess.
Yeah. A few other comments I just want to pop back, if that's okay. So we're just going back to the standing on the shoulders of giants. It was actually Newton, in his letter to Hooke. Some researchers have suggested he was actually using the phrase. It got cut off there as something to do with. I'm trying to read it here on the screen. As a veiled insult to Robert Hooke, who was rather a short man, apparently. Okay, thank you,
All right,
Mr. Kant, for that. Daniel, knowing your capacity is eluding everybody. It's so basic. And he follows up to that saying, knowing value or capacity.
Well, you need to know both, right? And in this diagram that you're sharing here, John, I would say that, look, your value is on the upper half, whether it's current or unrealized, and your capacity is on the lower half. It's in your time to market and your ability to innovate. That's the organization's capacity to deliver that value, which shows up on the top.
And something, Daniel, that you might find more useful when you're reading the evidence-based management guide, as Srikant as well, maybe. I often think of ability to innovate as inability to innovate. In fact, until I started thinking about it like that, I was getting very confused reading the 4 key value areas, because I saw a huge overlap between time to market and ability to innovate. But when I thought of it as inability to innovate, because a lot of the sample measures in the appendix of the document are about what's preventing us from making progress.
That's true. It's important to note in the EBM guide, as you say, there are example measures that we could use in each of these key value areas, which we call key value measures, just to be clear, KVMs. And you're right. First of all, the KVMs have limits. First of all, they're a bit software-centric today, and the Agile community is well beyond just focusing on the software space, and has been for quite a while. And so the finding the measures that are appropriate for you, I think the KVAs are broadly applicable across any industry that I've worked with. KVMs will be unique to your particular domain, and so exploring which measures are appropriate for you is an important exercise to realize whether you've got good measures or not.
And I think there was an addition to the 2020 version as well, because I noticed something there which rings a bell with me in my current client. It was basically a reference to the speed of decision making, which I guess would be an ability to innovate at the bottom left corner. It could even be time to market, actually.
It could be both of those. That's right. Usually, when we're talking about time for decision making, it does affect both, because very often things are sitting around waiting for decisions to be made, maybe by approval, maybe some manager has to approve something. And we know from value stream mapping activities that very often 80% of the time or more, even up to 90% or greater, is spent with no work happening. It's just we're sitting around waiting for some form of decision. And at the same time, the longer the decisions take, the more innovation gets squelched along the way, because so these things are interrelated, right? If it takes too long, we end up canceling things. We may never get started to begin with, because other things take so long that we can't get to these other things. So that you'll find that that's why don't put too much energy into the models. The real key, like almost everything in the Agile world, is to stimulate conversation and discussion. And how you categorize the measures isn't nearly as important as understanding the idea of balance and looking at the holistic picture.
A few more comments coming in, and welcome to the YouTube viewers, and apologies that there was a problem. First time using restream.io, I seemed to fork the URL somehow. People were waiting to let your beautiful photograph, Mark, and they weren't showing, but it's
terribly sorry to hear.
But they're here now, and thank you for joining, and we'll make sure that people get the link to the recording as well. I'll make sure that afterwards. In fact, 10 to 15 times people who would have been here tend to view later on. We probably lost 20 viewers concurrent, Mark, because of that, so apologies for that. So just jumping back here to a few comments. So Vlad Hurdian, So unrealized is not equal to money spent, to be honest, what John said. Yeah.
That's right.
And Ahmed, thank you for sending a comment. So how UV, is that meant to be UX?
I think
UV?
that means unrealized value.
Yeah. Unrealized value and research and development are related. I mean, we have an R&D team within the organization. Depends on what they're doing.
Yeah, the R&D team itself is related to unrealized value because we want them to be spending at least some of their capacity on that unrealized value. I should say trying to capture some of that unrealized value. Back to the logic model, obviously they're going to be, the R&D team itself is an input, and they're going to be doing work, producing perhaps new valuable things. They're going to be doing other things that are part of the current value, like keeping existing customers happy, keeping the systems up and running. Those things are part of the current value, but actually take away from ability to innovate. To your point earlier, John, a lot of the KVMs and the ability to innovate are what's preventing us from innovating. So the amount of our budget we spend on maintenance, for example, would be a prevention of innovation. So the R&D team in and of itself is going to need to have some of their capacity focused on current value. Otherwise, that value will decline over time because it's not a reliable product, or doesn't have enough uptime or availability, or we're not responsive enough to our current customers. But some of the capacity needs to be spent on capturing unrealized value, especially for high UV product areas. Otherwise, our competitors are going to capture that value, and the market will be theirs instead of ours. So that's the issue. And if we're not balancing it properly, and as we talk about different products, of course, we're talking about balancing our portfolio. We've got to be spending some capacity on unrealized value.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of comments. Come back to Shoulders of Giants. There's a variation on it, which is the one that I actually was associating with Goldratt. And so Daniel is saying, forget about Newton and Einstein. Thank you, Daniel, for that comment. And then follow up, yeah, he was a real genius. I agree with that too. Funny, another little bug with Restream.io, it truncates people's comments, which is very annoying. So I'll just read out the full comment.
Great.
So from Vlad, unrealized value can relate to any given part of an organization, not just R&D. You can build an innovative product or feature and still not realize value because sales take too long.
Absolutely right. Yeah. It's a holistic, these are holistic key value areas, and the measures we need are holistic. R&D is only one part of it. And I would say that in the Agile community, which generates most of this discussion we're having, really, the tendency is to focus in on the R&D space because a lot of the Agile practices first emerged there. But as you just said, if we don't sell the product that we've developed, it's an output with no outcome. Then we don't realize, we never achieve that unrealized value.
Yeah, just a couple of comments as well on this evidence-based management paper. I've been using it since it was published in early 2019, and I heard people were talking about it in Scrum that argued before that. One of the first things I would say is that I have used it in contexts where people weren't using Scrum. So the people might be thinking this is a Scrum.org thing, and so it's about Scrum. But of course, Scrum.org now have complementary practices. They've got Scrum with Kanban, they've got Scrum with Lean UX, or Scrum with UX as they put it. And I would even say that if you're using just pure Kanban or Lean UX or design thinking, I really don't see any constraints there. It's just giving you a new set of spectacles to put on to kind of almost like X-ray vision to kind of help you to see what maybe your potential opportunities for measurement.
That's right. And thinking about the management part, what we do with the evidence, that model that we talked about of incrementally experimenting with, creating hypotheses about what will make progress toward our goals and affect leading indicators, and trying it out through experimentation and measuring it and then inspecting and adapting, that scientific method approach is really just empiricism. And Scrum is empirical as well. But when I go into my clients, if I talk to senior managers and executives and say, hey, you ought to use Scrum to achieve these goals, no, I'm not going to be able to have a conversation like that. Not that it never occurs, maybe in small software startups, but in more traditional organizations, that's not a conversation we can have. But I can talk about how the complexity of this new environment they're trying to create requires experimentation, and here's one way to manage that experimentation, and we can have a conversation like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads me on to something as well that I think maybe the evidence-based management guide doesn't quite strike the bullseye with yet, but you could get there indirectly from the guide. A couple of things that it doesn't capture for me. One of them would be, how does it feel? How does it feel for people? I had a big debate with people in the LESS community last year about this, and a lot of these measures are wonderful. And one gentleman said to me, well, why don't we just measure how inspired people are? And I was trying to figure out how to do that. And the closest I could get to it was maybe using SenseMaker from Cognitive Edge to just try and get sense of the mood. You know what I mean? You get. Have you done any work in that area, Mark, or what are your thoughts if you were to experiment?
Well, maybe peripherally, I would say that we've tried to do things around what we typically call employee engagement.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of trying to get their feeling and their mood and their perceptions about what it's like to work here, and because. And by the way, coming back to KVAs, we consider the employee engagement. Most of us would say that that's part of the current value of the organization. Do we have engaged employees that can help us? Of course, it affects our ability to innovate. It affects our time to market. But without engaged employees, there's no way we're going to capture any of that unrealized value, because it requires them to go above and beyond. We have to do more than just business as usual. And people who are, if I'm an employer and my employees are only here to collect their paycheck, I could understand that, but that's not the level of engagement I need to beat our competition and become, and ultimately to achieve our purpose and our mission, whatever that might be, which is well beyond any financial considerations.
Yeah, that kind of bothers me a little bit personally, because I follow a guy called Marshall Goldsmith. You might have heard of him. He's like a fairly active executive coach. There's a thing called Thinkers 50, and he was like top of that for quite a long time. He's effectively retired, but he's still supporting his existing clients, I believe. And he gives out a lot about engagement surveys, because like the most famous one would be like the Gallup 12, right?
Yeah, right.
And
I'm not a fan, but
yeah. So like, I think you're with me on this, right? So it's kind of it's almost like, what did the organization do for me, but the very little of, did I do my best today too, XXX,
I think a very holistic view, and you could use the Gallup 12, but I think you ought to supplement it if you do. But there are other models out there. It's difficult because we got to make it actionable somehow, right? If all we do, and this is the error that I see in talking about certain kinds of qualitative measures like engagement, whether it's customer engagement or employee engagement, if you're not going to do anything about the measures, you're better off not measuring it at all. Because employees are telling you how upset they are, and now you do nothing. Well, it's just going to make it worse.
Yeah. And that leads on to another thing, right? Because I have this belief, I'm doing kind of an experiment on this at the moment, that how inspired people are might be driven by, because I think people are motivated. It's about whether they get demotivated. And Dr. Lance Secretan, an American guy I only met a couple of years ago, I was kicking myself. I only met him then because he was 85 years of age then, with hardly any wrinkles on his forehead.
Really?
And he skis 4 times a day. Sorry, not 4 times a week in the winter, and climbs mountains in the summer. And his secret to long life is and health is seeing the best in others, which I thought was interesting. Okay, slap on the hand. Sometimes I can be a little bit cynical, And he said the difference between motivation and inspiration is people who are motivated, you to motivate people, you light a fire under them, right? you give them a bonus. You're basically getting them to do something that they want to do. Whereas if they're inspired, by his definition anyway, you're lighting a fire inside them.
Yeah.
So often I think it's about, are we fixing problems? Are we, we can say this is where we're going, but we're not, if we're not fixing things,
Yeah, and I think, that other people would talk about that as extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation, right?
Okay,
Am I in an environment where I'm going to be punished or rewarded for doing this thing, whether I want to do it or not? Whereas if I'm intrinsically motivated, I want to get out of bed early so I can go make this thing happen. Yep.
Indeed,
and we need to create an environment like that. So coming back to evidence-based management, if we felt that our employees weren't intrinsically motivated enough or inspired enough, however we wish to put it, we can measure that through things like these qualitative kinds of surveys and put numbers on it and things like that. But we're going to have to find the actions that we can take. And of course, human behavior, and especially the way people feel, is maybe one of the most complex things ever. So the best we could hope for is to have, a hypothesis of what might improve people's opinions of where they work and this environment, and try it out through experimentation and measure those leading indicators. Really, I have to say, in the hope. And it'd be nice if you could say, well, there's a script you can follow, and you don't have to hope. You just do this formula. But life isn't like that.
Yeah.
Let's put together some hypotheses. Let's try them out and see if it actually improves. And if it does, awesome, we can keep it and expand on it and increase that. And if it doesn't, let's drop it and try something else. Because if we don't get that level of inspiration in our employees, we're not going to realize the unrealized value in this organization.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mark. Just one final thing I wanted to ask you about, and so it's kind of like a little warning for people as well. If they want to ask any questions, that would be a great time to get their final questions in. One of the things that I've been kind of working in the last year and a half in particular is objectives and key results. So I was initially dubious about them. John Doerr, he's this wonderful website, whatmatters.com, and he's got very good TED Talk, and was initially just felt a little bit command and control, but I looked into it a little bit, and I think I found a way where you can kind of make it work with agility without compromising our values, sort of principles, so to speak. If, for example, you're using Scrum, I'm in a non-tech environment at the moment. If we were using 1 month sprints, for example, you could have like committed objectives and key results for the next month because the sprint is heading for that goal, right? And then for the rest of the quarter, I'd have aspirational OKRs. So that way I wasn't kind of breaking Agile by having, committing to everything to be done by the end of the quarter when actually we're only planning on a few weeks at a time kind of thing with a little bit of a forecast looking ahead. What has your experience been, Mark, with OKRs? Or maybe you've been working with alternative models. I don't know.
No, I think OKRs are very popular right now. Of course, originally developed by Andy Grove at Intel, and then John Doerr took them before the website was the book Measure What Matters. It's an outstanding book. And I think they're totally compatible with what we're talking about, the idea of OKRs. And coming back to the Scrum example, right? In Scrum, we talk about committing to the sprint goal. And of course, that's a very short period of time, but even a month. So we can commit to goals in Scrum. We just don't want to commit to that the work will get us there. We have to, that'll emerge because, of course, in Scrum, we're using Scrum in a complex environment. Back to this empirical approach that we've been talking about. And EBM is the same way. So we can commit to an objective. The key results are the ways we believe will get us to that objective, to that goal. And we're going to try it out. So we're enhancing OKRs by saying the key results are our hypothesis about what it will take for us to get to that objective. And now we're going to try out those hypotheses through experimentation and measurement and determine whether it really will get us there or it won't. And of course, we can have longer term goals than just a single sprint. We have that in Scrum. They're not articulated specifically, but we do talk about product vision. We do talk about the long-term value. We talk about forecasting business objectives. And all of those things are just other ways of talking about, again, objectives and the means by which we think we can get there, i.e. key results. So I think it's totally compatible. There are other approaches besides OKRs that are also compatible. I mentioned earlier 4 disciplines of execution. People might have heard of wildly important goals. That's what they call them instead of OKRs. And good to great John Collins, who talked about big, hairy, audacious goals, and any of those. It's kind of like pick one. And if I would say it this way, if your organization is already adopting OKRs, we're not talking about supplanting them in any way. What we're saying is let's add a framework that can help you actually achieve them for the ones that are those stretch, ambitious, innovative goals. If you've got OKRs that are business as usual, you don't need EBM for that. But for the stretch goals, EBM may be able to help.
Yeah, thank you. And the other thing as well is we need to kind of capture how leaders are showing up. And one of the things that we need to capture is, do they see commitments as guarantees?
Yep.
But this is where there's a little bit of tension between what John Doerr is saying and what we're trying to do in the Agile world, because what he's saying is, like, when he practices this, I believe in Google or Intel or wherever he does his work, that if there's a committed OKR in trouble, they really put laser focus on that, because they need to treat it like there's an emergency kind of thing. So that for me is kind of bordering on treating it as a guarantee. That's where there's a little bit of tension, I think.
Well, but they also will talk about in the stretch goals, they would only expect success about 70% of the time. So there's an expectation that let's say a third roughly of the goals will not be achieved. The objectives will not be achieved. So OKRs is a bit of a holistic approach, and someone has just posted that it's not metrics only, and that's absolutely true, because it also includes alignment, and we've talked about that from an EBM perspective as well. That there may be OKRs, let's say, for your CEO, and your organizations will have to have their own objectives in order to help the organization achieve those bigger objectives. And EBM works the same way. Again, what EBM adds is a framework to actually take steps to make progress toward those goals. And sometimes you won't succeed. They're ambitious, they're audacious, they're very complex, and we would expect that some of those goals are not achievable, at least not in the way or to the degree that you want. And that should be expected.
Yeah, one of the things I love about OKRs in particular is that instead of like management by objectives, where the objectives come down from on high and come down to everybody else, get cascaded down. What I love about OKRs, but I think this is where a lot of consulting firms are missing a trick, is that they're not doing the lateral dependency checking on, okay, so Mark, I need to deliver something. That means you have to do my dependency in the next quarter. But if you're not able to do that, we can kind of do a cross check to see.
Yes.
It's like a level setting is for the organization, isn't it?
It is, and both the OKR, the work that John Doerr's done, in documenting, if you will, the idea of OKRs from Intel. Back to this idea of the hierarchy, there does need to be alignment up and down and across, and they warn us about trying to do it sequentially, where you start at the top and you go to the next level in a very top-down centric fashion. They specifically say don't do that. Same thing in these other models I've introduced that I've mentioned, like 4 disciplines of execution. You can't, if you do that, it will take forever, number one. You won't have good buy-in, because you need the people who are going to take the action to be participative in the process of figuring out what we're going to do and what we need to do. So yes, we establish some big goals at the top, and then we need a very broad, parallel, inclusive process to get everybody engaged and how we're all going to contribute to that all at the same time, with the kinds of cross-checking that we're talking about to make sure that we don't have conflict. Well, it's not that we can't have any conflict, but we just want to be aware of it, want to be knowledge about it, so that we can be paying attention to that, as well as where we can reinforce each other, that we're taking advantage of that reinforcement, that alignment, to drive progress toward the goals.
Thank you very much. There's a few comments, and we might kind of wrap it up then, depending on what comes out of the comments. So how about outcomes and key results instead of committed objectives and key results?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be perfectly happy to change the words, but if you've already got it in your organization and it's objectives and key results, that's good. Remember, the word commitment is a sliding scale. in the OKR model for stretch goals, which is what we're talking about for EBM, right?
Yeah.
Regular business as usual goals. You don't need EBM for that. If it makes sense in your organization to have those and commit to them, fine, but that's not what we're talking about. So remember, committed here is an expectation that at least 30% of the time, we're not going to make it.
Yeah. Follow up, desired outcomes, think mission, command, and commander's intent in that context. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. See where you're going, Vlad. Yeah.
Exactly right.
And Srikant, the OKRs are not a metric only used for an alignment conversation. Yeah, I agree with that. Right. As Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. Yeah. And again, I just repeat what John said and says, just be careful that whatever you're measuring, it doesn't become a proxy for where you're supposed to be going.
That's real common, and that's why, for example, in the evidence-based management diagram, we've got the goal front and center, and all the conversations we have, the goal is always prominently displayed. Yeah,
I like that, and the new version is really good. Vlad is kind of following up here that, it does get lost along the way. People tend to basically just relabel management by objectives and cascade it down and call them OKRs, and I think it needs people like us really to kind of make sure. One of the things that I'm experimenting with is, regardless of what method, framework or none that teams are using, I'm using Kanban boards to roll up into objectives and key results, so you can see how they're doing.
Awesome.
So yeah,
there's a lot of great. I think the Agile community has really invested in techniques to highlight the transparency that we need, and alignment is one of those things that needs to be as transparent as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Which again is where there's more tension, because that means I need multi-level Kanban, which means I need some kind of electronic tool, and it's kind of like, is it worth it? I'm seeing the benefit basically so far, but let's see how the experiment goes.
I like a lot of those, by the way, in the book Measure What Matters. John talks about some of his case studies, which are, at least a third of the book. Many of them start off with very simple tools like Google Docs, for example, but at some point that becomes untenable, that you can't check for alignment when you have hundreds of Google Docs. It doesn't work anymore, and you need some kind of tool to help you. Yeah,
and this is what I worried about, because when I asked some consultants, how they were actually doing this, they were basically hiding away the OKRs within the function that they were doing. So we were missing the visibility across the function, so you could see what was going on.
Yeah.
Which is why I like the Kanban board idea, where it all rolls up. But there are tools actually for this. But the problem with a lot of the OKR tools is they go right down to the individual. I kind of stop them at team or team of teams level,
right,
as opposed to the Mark level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I don't want to be measured.
Follow up and from Srikant, and sometimes from key results you can adjust your goal. Absolutely, that's what Mark was saying earlier. That wasn't a straight line. It was there's a little bit of Cynefin in it as well, and not just how the categories. Cynefin, they talk about direction of travel, don't they? And basically evolving from where you are.
Right. In that complex space, it's very about an emergent solution. That's the key word that they tend to use. And so what is the path to the goal? Well, that's going to emerge. We can't tell you exactly what that is.
Yeah. So follow up to that one is our pivot. Thank you, Srikant. And another one from Srikant. This might be the last one of today. So final shout out. If you have any more comments, now is the time. So when you have teams, you align OKR to a set of teams or product. I agree. Yeah, totally, Srikant. Yeah. I try to do it at team of teams that are within the product area, basically.
Right.
Sometimes you can't help. Sometimes you can't help where you start. So we'd like to have organizational agility, but we get hired into a function, so we might start there. And as I said a few months ago on another video, I wouldn't start there. But if you're in there, you kind of start there. But you try to get the least worst OKRs where you are, and try to spread it out. Get your feelers into the other functions as quickly as you can, as diplomatically as you can.
Well, and you can use EBM to improve your measures, because we want better evidence.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't have any more questions coming in, Mark. I want to thank you very much for your comprehensive explanation of measurement.
It's been fun.
Description I've seen. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I'll make sure that the recording links get sent out. sorry we lost some viewers tonight. Sorry to the YouTube viewers. I'll talk to Restream, try to find out what happened there, but I'll make sure everybody gets the link to the recordings on all the meetup groups and on LinkedIn and all the social media. So thank you so much, Mark, for your time. Really appreciate it. And thank you, viewers, as well, for all your comments and viewing.
Very good. Thank you very much, John.
Okay, thank you. You can see on there, Mark.